The Opinion with Michael J. How is everybody? So, April 21, Monk Debates. This is Andrew Coyne, Globe and Mail, with Rudyard Griffiths, writer for the National Post, or columnist for the National Post, Star, Hub, also anchorman for CTV and Business News Network. So, they're together here discussing how the Conservative Party's anti-Trudeau messaging undermined their ability to provide Canadians with an appealing platform in an election that does not include the former PM Trudeau. Mark Carney, meanwhile, is acting like the grown-up in charge when a crisis hits, even though his big spending promises suggest he's not the blue liberal many center-right Canadians had hoped. Rudyard and Andrew also talk about Trump's threats to U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and why the independent authority of central banks is so integral to the functioning of democracies. Now, I'm going to key in right now on the U.S. Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell, because the President, Donald Trump, based on precedents in law in the states, does not have the legal authority to fire him. But this is not a normal administration down in the United States. Like, they're not adhering to Supreme Court orders. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there, because that could really shake up the world markets if he does something by getting rid of Jerome Powell. But nonetheless, in the interim, let's get into this podcast.
Welcome
with
to the Monk
Rudyard
Dialogues.
and
I'm Rudyard
Andrew
Griffiths, the
Coyne.
chair of the Monk Debates. Great to be back with you, our audience, watching this in high definition video or tuning into our regular podcast.
We are in high definition for a while now.
By
Just thought I'd
Andrew
throw
Coyne
that
again
out there
for another one of our continuing conversations. Andrew, so fortunate to have you here.
Nice to be here with you in high definition video.
Yes, we're
lads.
revealing all of our wrinkles and creaks and groans together. Campaign, Andrew. We will be heading to the polls next week for what everyone has said is a consequential vote. How do you feel this election is wrapping up? Do you feel that the country has debated the big issues that maybe it should have to position itself in a way of strength post-election and the uncertain environment that we meet?
No. The Liberals' strategy in this election has been to talk about only one issue, which is Donald Trump and the tariff war and the larger existential struggle. But there hasn't been a whole lot of policy discussions about that beyond things that the parties agree on. So, and they tend to agree on things that are kind of fatuously easy. So everyone's in favor of building more pipelines. No one's really discussed, well, how would we actually overcome Indigenous and provincial opposition to that? Everybody wants to cut taxes, but nobody wants.
As far as pipelines, if you really have paid attention, you will find that Carney has explained in more detail as far as using the powers to get the pipelines fast-tracked, but he has also maintained the caveat that also you'll have to get the approval of the Indigenous tribes and Quebec. There's not every province wants pipelines, so these are the things that have to be juggled. But Mark Carney was very succinct and made his point about that at the very beginning.
To just say how they're going to pay for them. So to the extent that other issues have intruded into the campaign, it's been very brief. During the debates, because you couldn't just talk about Donald Trump the whole time, then we had a little more discussion, such as it was, about some other issues. But the Liberals have hugged so close to the Conservatives on policy terms, and the Conservatives have not done enough from the perspective of their own self-interest, but also from the standpoint of differentiation in the marketplace, to stake out territory where the Liberals couldn't go. Yeah. So as a result, not much has happened in this election campaign. all the big movement, as we discussed last time, was before the writ was dropped. And I shouldn't say dropped, that's a terrible thing. Before the writ was issued. Fell into that trap. And it's really all, people made up their minds about what they thought about the leaders. There was some suggestion that there might have been some tightening the polls, maybe a little bit, but the last polls I've been seeing are still in the 5, 6, 7, 8% range. And if it's anywhere even, then the Liberals win.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the policy we have seen during this election. Just in the last day or so from the time of this recording, we now have a full Liberal platform. We'll supposedly get the Conservative platform together. When you look at that Liberal platform, what impressions are you left with? I think many people have commented on the significant increase in deficits. Maybe some people surprised by that, thinking that Mark Carney was initially presenting himself more as a blue Liberal, someone who was cutting the capital gains tax, cutting the carbon tax, positioning Canada's economy for economic competitiveness. What do you make of this Liberal platform?
Well, people, Conservatives in particular, are professing themselves to be shocked and horrified by it. I'll be a little more persuaded by that if they bring in a platform that has smaller deficits. But given that they're calling for significantly larger tax cuts, that would imply that they'd have to bring in some spending cuts. So, yeah, the Liberals are proposing a lot more spending. I think it's fair to say it's different from the previous government insofar as a lot more of that spending looks to be genuine bona fide investment capital rather than operational expenses. Now, we'll see when we go through the nitty-gritty of it. But at first glance, that seems to be true. They themselves have parties do this for some reason, have overstated their own spending increases. So they put out this figure of $130 billion over 4 years. Everyone duly reported that. When you dug into it, those were for new measures, which included both spending increases and tax cuts. And when I dig through it, I find that, and you net out, spending cuts and tax increases, when you net it all out, it's about $60 billion in more spending and about $16 billion in tax cuts. If you look, I will be unsurprised to find that the Conservative platform will be not hugely different in the overall numbers, but more weighted towards tax cuts and less towards spending increases. So the differences between the parties are not as large. I think we'll find in the end they're both going to run larger deficits. Look, in an immediate crisis, you could make a case for some deficit spending. If the crisis is as serious as we've all said it was, if, for example, we need to make rapid increases in defense spending, unparalleled in recent times, there's a case to be said you don't have to load all that onto the current tax base. I think the disappointing thing is, okay, you've got to make all these spending increases. Maybe you can make a case for more borrowing, but have you done anything to try to cut out unnecessary current spending to make room for that new spending? And so it's harder to make that case for deficit spending when there's been no effort by either party, seriously, to make any spending cuts to make room. So the Liberals pencil in billions of dollars that are going to come from productivity increases, and Mark Carney will talk about that that's going to come from AI. Okay, maybe, but that seems like pretty sketchy. Yeah. And then the Conservatives, it's,
consultants.
We'll cut consultants, we'll cut foreign aid. Yeah. So just as no party, left or right, ever wants to raise taxes on you, right? They'll if they're daring to talk about raising taxes on other people.
Yeah.
Similarly, nobody wants to cut anything from spending that anybody actually values.
Yeah.
But further to that, you got to remember one important thing. When you have tax cuts, even though people in the general population love tax cuts, that is not productive revenue for the country to help increase gross domestic product. This is what you have to understand. And that's a very important difference. When you're doing these big tax cuts, that's a lost leader, because that is not revenue that's used to generate new revenues, to increase the gross domestic product, to increase the productivity, to be able to lessen the impacts of the affordability crisis and the housing crisis. And these are very important differences, and you have to understand how they tie into one another.
And that's ridiculous. We're not going to get restoration of balance to our finances without cutting somebody's sacred cow. And at this point, nobody's talking.
Yeah, but hold on a second. This is where we've got to get with the modern era. You know, Polyev is still stuck in the Friedman economic economist policy principles, which, date further back. And if you look at modern macroeconomic theory and understand how that works, then it's a different ballgame. And I'm going to explain a very important factor. And everybody wants to balance the budget. You maybe need to balance your budget at home, but there's different ways depending on how if you're self-employed, that you need to maximize in different ways. So balancing a budget at home would not necessarily be the most prudent thing. And with the government more so, because if you go to Maynard Keynes and infrastructure spending investment is a huge productivity builder for a country. And once you're into the big heavy tax cuts, you lose that capital that could be gone into productivity to come back into the system to help the people. And I'll give you an example of that. In 1995, Conservative government in Ontario, Mike Harris, they sold $3 billion, 407. Now, the private companies, which included SNC Lavalin, and everybody says, oh, SNC with Trudeau, but you got to understand, Mike Harris, he was in that honeypot before anybody, and he was a conservative. So they sold it for $3 billion. Meanwhile, it was a cash cow and generated $30 billion. So just to balance a budget didn't make any sense. And these are the things that people miss and misunderstand. And even though Stephen Harper is an economist by education, you wouldn't know it during the time that they were in government with Pierre Poilievre before young Justin Trudeau took over. So these are very important factors that you need to really understand, because Stephen Harper handed over a government that was in recession, a country that was in recession, to Trudeau. And then within 3.5 years, December 2019, we went into a pandemic that continued where it affected supply chain. Supply chain issues only started coming back online to normal within the last 6 months. So it's been a long, difficult road since the handover from Stephen Harper to young Justin Trudeau back in 2015, 2016, early 2016.
And what do you think, Andrew? You mentioned it because there's been a lot of talk about so-called, meeting the moment by all these leaders and campaigns. Yet here we are with both campaigns, the front-runner campaigns, the Liberals and the Conservatives, contemplating expensive tax cuts. Yeah. Tax cuts in the multiple billions of dollars in the face of what is supposedly a moment of national coming together. People even dare to talk about national sacrifice in face of these threats, yet we're engaging in large-scale middle-class tax cuts as they're framed.
Well, that's the thing. Look, I
borrowed, debt financed.
That's right. Yeah. And what the worst part about it is, they're the kinds of tax cuts that pay no dividend in terms of higher productivity.
Yes.
I would be prepared to defend, as meeting the moment, tax cuts that were designed to supercharge growth in the economy, because that's absolutely what we need to do. We've needed to do that for years. We've been, in the recent years, we've been shrinking in per capita terms. But one way of meeting the Trump thing, not just the direct Trump threat of I'm going to annex you or I'm going to slap all these tariffs on you, but the broader Trump threat, which is he's wrecking the global economy. So if we've already got really anemic, really weak growth, if we have a real challenge that we needed even before all this to get our growth up because of our looming fiscal challenges with the aging population, added to which we now have this defense and security burden that we've got to start to step up and pay, then we really need to get growth up so that we can persist and still make forward momentum in the face of these headwinds from Trump. So if ever there should have been a growth election with both parties putting forward serious growth agendas, this would be it. And what most economists would tell you would be, if we're going to get our investment rates up, we need to get our taxation on capital down, radically down. And instead what they did, the Liberals, to some extent, the Tories to an even greater extent, was they blew billions and billions of dollars cutting the bottom rate of tax. Yeah. Now, I understand that's politically popular. We shouldn't confuse that with looking after the interests of those on low.
Yeah, so this is a good point. It is politically popular, and that's why the Liberals have to do it, because the Conservatives are doing it. It's an unfortunate byproduct because of the platitudes of Mr. Polyev, axed the carbon tax and how it influenced people's way of thinking it's going to make them rich just because you get rid of the carbon tax, which carbon tax is gone and nobody's all of a sudden become rich. And then right after the debate, you've got Pierre Poilievre going out to the lectern, and then it's axe the single-use plastics tax. I'm going to change the single-use plastic tax. Then it was axe the food tax, and then it was axe the inflation tax. And this is all since the debates, and so he's going back to the platitudes. No meat and potatoes, real stuff that's going to make life-altering changes to anybody, but people fall into the trap, and they get worried and they get scared, and fear and anxiety takes over them because of these platitudes and tropes. Axe the carbon tax. Axe the single-use plastic tax. Axe the food tax. Axe the inflation tax. Without going into detail what's really going on, you're misled, it's misrepresented, and you fall into that trap just so a guy can get elected. But the point that we are interrupting these guys is this here. So, first of all, this is the tax GST cut for home buyers. Now, Poilievre's plan is to allow no GST up to a purchase of $1.3 million. Now, you have to understand, in both these plans, once you hit the maximum amount, whether it's $1.3 million for a purchase of a home under Poilievre or $1 million under Carney, then that GST rebate, zero cost of GST, doesn't apply. So if you look at Poilievre's plan, $1.3 million and under allows the GST full amount to be removed of a total of $65,000. In Carney's plan, it's $1 million, and $1 million and under is up to $50,000 maximum. So the government has to make up the difference, because that revenue, GST revenue that's going to be lost, $65,000 in Pierre Poilievre's plan for each individual home, up to $1.3 million. In Carney's plan, $50,000 up to $1 million. And it's a big difference. Right away, you're 30% more with Poilievre's plan, 1.3 to 1. But there's another significant difference of the two plans as well. Poilievre's plan is the same for everybody. There's no exclusions. Carney's plan is only for first-time home buyers. So that's a big difference. Those things make a big difference, because you notice earlier I mentioned tax breaks. You got to be careful with the tax breaks, because that's just less money. That's increase your operating capital. It doesn't generate any new GDP to filter back into catalyze the economy, so that it makes the affordability crisis less pronounced and home ownership less pronounced. It's as simple as that. Just saying there, folks. So there we are with that one. Now let's look at the next one here. Now if you look at the 15% tax cut for Poilievre, That amounts to costing lost revenue because it's based at 2.25% of $14 billion per year. Now the Liberal one is also based on a 15,000 bracket for each person, but it's only at 1%, which means I didn't have a chart for it ready, but means that it's $5.9 billion a year cost. And that's quite significant. It's less than half the cost of the Conservative Party. So you've noticed two differences right away. Because Andrew Coyne mentioned it to you and I mentioned it to you, these tax cuts is just lost revenue. Produces nothing that comes back to stimulate and make your life better, or the government, to increase any productivity. It's just lost money. So I'll give you another example. Because of the NDP pressure for the GST, and because of the Ontario Conservatives, giving money away, the feds had to do the same thing, because that's why you've got the Liberals doing a tax cut just like the Conservatives, because if they don't, they lose the vote. But if you look at the GST credit that was done when Trudeau was there, and Chrystia Freeland got her knickers in a twist and ended up resigning as finance minister thereafter because of that. But this is the state you're in, because like Doug Ford would spend $6 billion to give a $200 check to citizens for no reason. It's just wasted money. But it costs $6 billion, and that's out of your operating budget that is not productive whatsoever. It's a liability. So that GST thing was great. People stocked up in diapers and all that stuff, but the cost was many billions of dollars to the federal budget that was lost. Never going to recover it. Gone. And that's where the NDP, you got to be careful, and especially in this environment coming up. Got to be careful with these tax cuts. And that's where Carney's been prudent, because $14 billion for the Conservatives, and even though the platform is similar with the Liberals, it's only $5.9 billion. So over the course of 4 years, the Liberal cost is, I think, $23.6 billion, and the Conservative cost is $56 billion, and it's a big difference when you look at it that way. It's very important you understand that. Okay, so back to the show we go here.
Low income for two reasons. One is people on really low income don't pay any tax.
Yeah.
Secondly, people on high income also benefit from cutting the bottom rate of tax. That's on their first tranche of income. So it was hugely irresponsible of both parties, vastly expensive, and will pay zero payoff in terms of productivity, because the people at the bottom end who are paying that tax don't have any disposable income to save and invest. People at the top end, that's not their marginal income. That's not their next dollar that they're thinking about investing. You're basically giving them free money.
Did all that
that's a tax cut on money they've already earned.
I was muted.
So that's one of the biggest disappointments in the whole campaign. The Tories did it because they thought they could win votes. The Liberals did it to match the Tories.
Yeah. And it comes against a backdrop, Andrew, of a challenging decade for Canada on a whole bunch of different metrics, from per capita GDP to, as you say, foreign direct investment. So where do we come out of this campaign if we're not dealing with some of these root problems that are at the core of the economy and Canada's own story, regardless of the Trump threat? What does that say about where the country is right now? Some people have hypothesized, Andrew, I've heard in the last few days, that simply the crisis isn't either here yet, or it's not intense enough for large portions of the voting electorate, especially older voters, to internalize the necessity of a larger set of changes that would be required. And that right now there's a lot of cosplay that different parts of the electorate are engaged in that are making them maybe feel good, making them feel like they're meeting the moment, they're part of this historic pushback against this aggressive American administration. But the reality is nobody is forgoing their cake right now.
Yes, to be the most charitable interpretation would be people have kind of kicked that decision one step down. What they're doing first is they're choosing, who do I trust to lead me?
Okay.
And so I'm being charitable here, that maybe you could interpret that as being, okay, the person I trust to lead me will be the person I'll trust to ask me for sacrifices in future. But first I want to figure out, who do I think has got the character and the judgment and the intellect and the experience to be able to handle these very weighty issues. As I say, that's a charitable interpretation. I think the difficulty for the Conservatives, it's one thing to say this is a change election. And I think once upon a time, not so long ago, they could have made that case like falling off a log. People were so fed up with the Prime Minister in particular, Prime Minister Trudeau in particular, that it wasn't that hard to persuade people we need to make a change and a change of party to govern. Once Trudeau was gone.
And that's based on just an axe the carbon tax slogan. That's all it was that really created that divide like that Andrew just explained. The axe the carbon tax. You got to get rid of the tax. Get rid of the government. We need change because this is taking the dream away from you. It's taking the dream away from you. The home, the kids, the yard and the backyard with the dog, and bring it on home. You've seen it. You witnessed it. That's the cause and effect of it.
Gone once Carney came in. I don't think the Conservatives have made a...
Oh, and axe the tax has been gone. Is anybody rich now? Has the affordability crisis been eliminated now? Has housing gotten any less costly? No. So axe the carbon tax, and carbon tax Trudeau. Then he tried carbon tax Carney. Those platitudes and tropes influenced a lot of the election people, the electorate, the population across Canada, and did irreparable harm because of the damage it caused.
Compelling enough case. If you're going to say, in other words, people were able to separate, and I don't think it's totally invalid to separate the party and government from the leader. We have a system that's so leader-centric, so driven by the Prime Minister, that it's not invalid to say we have a new Prime Minister, everyone's going to jump to his tune. I would say he has not made a sufficient case, I would say, of how different he would be. That's one of the things you could say about that platform they brought out, that yes, it shifted from current consumption to investment spending, but it still looks pretty large government, pretty liberal, government with a solution for every problem. So that.
Yeah, but here's the issue. Mark Carney's not, he's not like Pierre Poilievre. Like, Mark Carney will put you to sleep. Pierre Poilievre will friggin' attack you like a friggin' terrier at your pant leg. And that's why.
That's on the one hand. But for the Conservatives to make the case that we needed to change the government, and even with this new Prime Minister, I think they needed to map out a more distinctive policy agenda.
That's
they needed to go a little harder, a little more radical. Again, meeting the moment. If the situation is the crisis
real
that
policy
everyone agrees,
instead of tropes.
I think the public will be a little more ready than they might ordinarily be for some bold and radical policy proposals. But for whatever reason, I think because they still thought they had this in the bag, all they had to do was say, Mark Carney is just like Justin Trudeau, axe the tax, all these kind of stale lines, frankly. And so they didn't do enough to differentiate themselves either for their own electoral interests or, frankly, for the standpoint of giving the electorate a roadmap of here's a different path. Here's how different our policies would be from the governing Liberals. There's clearly there are some differences, but if you're trying to get people to change horses in the middle of a crisis when the natural instinct is to rally around the devil you know, then I think they needed to make a stronger case.
Yeah. I'm going to shift to Trump and some of the latest convulsions to our neighbor to the south in a moment. But before I do that, just one more question about the Liberals and this platform that came out today. Some have commented, I would include myself in this group, that I've been surprised over the last week or so of the campaign as Mark Carney seems to have decided to accept and, in some cases, perpetuate a lot of the policy assumptions and preferences of the Trudeau era. I think of his policy, for instance, with regards to the CBC, increasing the funding, openly stating that they would allow to continue to commercialize their operations. It seems surprising to me. It seems so needlessly, one, uncreative, second, literally creating no distinction between you as a supposed change candidate in a change election with your predecessor, Justin Trudeau. And then there are other elements that we've seen in the platform that similarly reflect this kind of continuity. Is that just simply Liberal confidence as this campaign has gone on, that they feel that they've won this and they can really now do what they want to do regardless? Or is it something else? Is it the fact that maybe Mark Carney is closer to Justin Trudeau in some of the preferences that he has, and maybe he's not the blue Liberal that many people seem to automatically assume at the beginning of the campaign, given his Goldman Sachs pedigree, his time at Brookfield and elsewhere?
Well,
Let me interject first beforehand. And you're going to see a trend. You've seen it down in the United States. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. The opinion of the Wall Street Journal has actually done some like financial opinions that are important. But Washington Post, which Jeff Bezos, he's been influenced because you notice he was at the inauguration. All these oligarchs were at the inauguration of Trump, and everybody's been threatened by Trump to toe the line. DEI, like it's become very fascist down there. And what's happened is media's been sued, and now they're afraid to say things that they normally would say because of the backlash from Trump. Guy's a very vengeful guy, and he's hurting them. So you don't have any media that's not influenced by money and influenced by political preference or partisan influence. And that's why CBC is so very important to the identity of Canada and the future of Canada, because it's not influenced by money. It can do proper journalism, and that's a what we're finding for a democracy, that's a very important asset to have, whether you agree with it or not. Because you've noticed that you got to look down south of the 49th parallel to the States to see what's happened to journalism, because they're putting people in jail, threatening people with lawsuits. ABC, Stephanopoulos, $16 million payout to Trump. CBC is important to Canadians' culture, Canadians' identity, and to the democracy of Canada and keeping that democracy active and alive.
Well, I think we may have discussed this before in a little bit, that people see in him what they want to see. So people will tell you they think he's a blue Liberal, or they think he's an environmentalist, or they think he's, so he's been able to kind of cover the waterfront a little bit, which if you can get away with it in politics is gold, because then everybody, Paul Martin for a while had that same thing going for him, where everyone thought that he was on their side. I think that, who knows, but I think one part of the calculation is you've got to give your base something reassuring that things haven't changed that much, while at the same time trying to tell other people in subtle ways that, well, I'll take off some of the woke edge. I won't be quite as obsessed. I thought it was fascinating, for example, when he appointed his cabinet, he made a point of making it must have been a decision of making it not exactly equal male and female, but very close to be. Like it was one short. So if you wanted to say, oh, at last that kind of group quote.
I want to interject again, because this anti-woke stuff is very authoritarian and fascist, because woke is just empathy. Let's make it simple. Woke is just empathy. And this anti-woke is very dangerous, because that's authoritarian and it's fascist right to the bone.
Quotas thing is over, you could see that, and if you want to say, oh, okay, he was a little bit off, but he's still,
it's almost there.
So he's playing a bit of that game. I think the calculation is that what most people were looking for had devolved into simply the persona of the leader, and that what the reassurance people were looking for is there a grown-up in charge? Does this guy look like he's got mature judgment? He's unflappable. He'll be able to respond to whatever situation arises, which again is not an invalid part of your calculus as a voter. Is you're trying to, 9 times out of 10, a prime minister has to deal with issues during his term as prime minister that he never foresaw, didn't plan, wasn't part of his platform. So it's fair game to say part of your assessment of any incoming prospective government is not just their platform or the things that they're telling you they're going to do, but what would they do in the unpredictable situation. So it's a mix. And
we witnessed that in the debate, and I'll tell you exactly how. Jagmeet Singh, in order to keep his political future alive, was interrupting to a point that was intrusive, like annoying. Pierre Poilievre did some interrupting as well. LeBlanc did some interrupting as well. Yet Carney never interrupted anyone during either one of those debates, French and English.
I think the calculation is people had significant enough numbers of people had said it's acceptable enough to me that we've changed leaders, and I think this guy seems to have what it takes, and I don't need to hear that much more from you in terms of how you change policy. You or I might not prefer that, but I think for a certain section of the electorate, that's enough.
Yeah.
And to further expound upon that, if you look at my my channel, I did a video with Scott Galloway interviewing Mark Carney. Scott Galloway, billion-dollar hedge fund owner, multi-million-dollar businesses he's created, NYU Stern Business School professor. So he was interviewing Mark Carney, and he asked great questions and got some great answers. And just go to my channel, it's there. And that'll give you everything you need to understand the difference between a liberal government under Mark Carney versus a conservative government under Poilievre.
And also,
especially when they're measuring him against Pierre Poilievre, and they're making an equal and opposite calculation of I'm not as enamored or assured that he would have what it took in these situations.
and he's also, as you say, politically, he's seemingly held now over weeks half of all potentially available NDP voters inside his enhanced coalition. So they're seeing enough, I guess, of a progressive impulse to feel comfortable voting Liberal. That's incredible.
Feeling comfortable voting Liberal and feeling very uncomfortable with Pierre Poilievre. So that's probably the biggest single part of this election is the collapse of the NDP vote, the race towards the Liberals. This is every election since I've been born. This has been the Liberal strategy, and they just kind of fell into their laps this time because of the Trump crisis, and because Poilievre did not do enough to differentiate himself from Trump. Now, that may be unfair to Poilievre, who's very
not unfair, because Trump, I had did earlier today. Was it today or yesterday? Midas touch. Ben Masella. He had he was interviewing Charlie Angus, but Ben was a professor at a university in California, and he's noticed that Poilievre is like that's where I got the Maple Mega North slogan from. That's where it came from. Once you understand the axe, the carbon tax, and then right after the debates, it's axe the single plastics tax, axe the food industry tax, and then it's axe the inflation tax. You're seeing a carbon copy of Donald Trump right there. All the signs are there, and this Trump issue is going to create a lot of problems, and people don't understand, and we've got to get more prepared for it. And the Scott Galloway interview that I have on my channel explains all those things in detail, as well explains that even America has an affordability crisis and a housing crisis. It's not exclusive to Canada.
different from Trump in a lot of ways, but he himself was doing enough things atmospherically, rhetorically, et cetera, because he was trying to appeal to a certain type of voter that's sympathetic to Trump, that if you're a New Democrat voter, you're picking up that vibe and you're nervous as hell. And so the minute the bell went off, they fled towards the Liberals. It's a remarkable thing, but it's very clear what was going on there. So people will say,
it's the survival of the Canadian democracy. It's important that we have to do that. We can't split the vote. We cannot let Pierre Poilievre get into position because we risk too much.
It's not Poilievre's fault because the NDP vote collapsed. No, he bears some responsibility for that happening. If you're a conservative leader in these kinds of situations, you've got to be doing your best. Obviously, you have to reassure your base that you're going to bring in the kinds of policies they're happy with, but at the same time, you've got to be non-scary to left-of-center voters. Otherwise, that left-of-center vote's going to coalesce around the Liberals.
Yeah. Let's shift to the U.S. On our last conversation, our viewers appreciated having your take on the fast-developing situation with the Trump administration. There seems to be a new crisis or permutation every 72 hours. The latest is ruminations on the part of the president about firing Jay Powell, the chair of the.
Okay, so we're going to cut out now. We're going to tie this up right now. We're not going to go further. I explained Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman down in the States. Trump's threatening to fire him, which is unlawful, but he may do it. And if he does do it, it's going to destabilize the markets in a way that is not been seen in 100 years. So what we're going to do here and now, I'm just going to recapitulate some important factors. Now, there was the defense spending of, this is Carney's plan here right now, defense planning or spending. So what's going to happen based on the NATO target of 2%? The way it's outlined within that $130 billion in new measures, within 4 years, Canada will be above the 2% target of NATO. And one of the brilliant things that have been done to help make that transition easier with Carney was the fact that Canadian Coast Guard will be part of our NATO defense capabilities. And that's very, very important. So with these moves, these investments will exceed our commitment to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. Secondly, the most important thing, because of all this spending and tax cuts, everyone's, wow, money, it's going to cause deficit, and all that stuff. Here's the reality. Now, if you look at these charts, the one on the left, you notice the operating budget is huge. Debt spending's 2.5%. This is that burnt yellow there, 2.5%. And then capital small. So the operating budget has taken up so much of overall revenues that's choking capital spending. So what Carney's doing is re-engineering the budget so that the operating budget is less of a burden, and that doesn't mean spending cuts for services that are going to affect Canadians. It doesn't mean that. But the operating budget's going to be less. He's going to try within 3 years to have it balanced. With the overall budget, you don't want to have it ever balanced. And I'll explain that in a different video if we get around to it. Because if you look at Coolidge of the President of the United States and Bill Clinton, both balanced budgets and with surpluses, and right after they had terrible recessions. So balancing a budget's not such a great idea because what it does is takes too much cash out of the system, and instead private lenders, which include banks, start lending more capital but higher risk investments, like the 2008 crash, and that's when we get into those problems. So you can spend more, and later you can tax a bit more once you've made things better for life, because that's the way you want to be able to generate an uplifting and prosperous economy. So if you look here, the operating budget's down, but the capital expenditure totally different, way different. And this is the big difference. And this is where you have to understand. Because the debt servicing charges as at 2021, 2.5%. Everybody makes it out to be huge, but 2.5% You got a loan that's at 2.5%, you'll be pretty happy. You got a mortgage at 2.5%, you're going to be pretty happy. Now, to change your operating budget and your capital expenditure budget to create new growth and only increase your debt charges by 0.3% to 2.8 is brilliant. And nobody sees that because everybody's caught up in axe the tax, axe the carbon tax, axe the plastic taxes, axe the food tax. Now it's axe the inflation tax. So you got Polyev saying, inflation because of all this spending. Meanwhile, based on just the housing tax cuts and GST, and also on the tax to the people of Canada, Polyev's plan's like double. It's more than double. So who's creating the inflation based on his principles? So that's where we're at. That's where we're at. That's where we're going. And this is where we're cutting out. We're cutting out. So I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Greatly appreciated. Understand this is a very important election. We can't be cutting taxes. We can't be cutting service. We can't be cutting. Because that's just going to strangle our economy. We've got to do like what Mark Carney's already done. He's had 2 premiers meetings. He set a target date of July 1 Canada Day to remove the barriers of trade across Canada, and that alone should help make up for the tariff effects. Because you've got right-wing influencers, partisan influencers. You got to understand National Post and a lot of the media is owned by American hedge fund that's pushing right-wing ideologies, and the cutting's not going to be the way to go here. We need to recreate a new economy. First of all, get rid of these interprovincial barriers. We need the industrial carbon tax to open new trade with the UK and Europe, and various other factors at play. So I'll leave it at that. I'm going to say love and peace to everybody. Questions, comments, please throw in chat. And thanks for watching. Ciao for now.